Chapter 9 deals with combat. The rounds in this combat system are 6 seconds long. 10 rounds equals 1 minute. Greater actions, these are things you can do, take up the whole round, while lesser actions you can do 2 of these per round. Free actions such as role-playing, drawing a sword are also included. Healing isn't like D&D. No one's going to hit you with a cure serious wounds and bop you right back up to where you were when you started. So yielding, giving up the combats, these are things that you really need to do in this sort of system, because if you get messed up, you're going to be messed up for a while. So you want to think about like a gritty system. If you don't have healing that will bring you back to full every day, it really changes how you go about doing things. Fighting or marksmanship are the 2 combat skills, and those would be versus the defense rating. As we talked about earlier, there was a section that talked about the weapons and had a little bit of fluff with them, just described them. In the combat section, there are the stats, the things you're going to need to actually use in combat. And the damage starts out with an ability, plus or minus some modifiers, and then your degrees of success. If you roll really high when you attack someone, you multiply those degrees of success to the damage listed for each weapon. So again, like any other system, you want to roll high, but when you roll high in this system, it actually gives you benefits. Combat defense is figured out by basically adding together agility, athletics, awareness, and defensive bonuses from shields and or parrying. Armor gives you DR, but it has movement and agility penalties as well. And while I understand systems that like to use armor as DR, I've sometimes come across issues with that where, I don't know, it just doesn't always seem to work as well as it sounds like it should. In theory, it sounds great. It's like, well, yeah, armor protects you from damage, but I don't know. In previous systems where I've actually done this and used those things, I've had problems with it. So I have not yet played this game, but I would just keep that in the back of my head. If DR gets to be kind of a problem, maybe do some sort of house rule to basically just fix it or tweak it a little bit. Some weapons do have training requirements, and there's like dice penalties, and there's certain specialties that you can use with certain weapons, and those are all listed so you can figure out which ones you need to basically put dice in. The interesting things about this section is it talks about the weapon qualities that can modify the standard weapons with mechanical boons and or penalties. So you want to look into that, because again, while there are magic swords, the Verilian steel, and other things like that, it's definitely not as prevalent as in D&D, where you have the golf bag full of +1 swords and an axe that axe of troll decapitation or something. So it's a little bit of a different style. It's more gritty. It has more of a historical feel to it. So as you play through it, I think you'll get those feelings, feel those vibes. The combat structure itself, it has a few steps that go through just detail what's going on. The battlefield is the description of the area, and sometimes you get modifiers to fighting, things like boundaries, obstacles, bystanders, things and objects on the battlefield that you could possibly use, visibility, and terrain. Number 2 is detection. This is like the stealth and surprise sort of round. There's initiative, agility with quickness, specialty, and it goes from high to low. Then it's the action segment. Like I said, 1 greater or 2 lesser, or you can do a multiple of free actions as well. There's a nice list of actions and details on each of them. And again, this might be a situation where that 3x5 card I talked about with the social combat, you might want to bring back again if they don't have their own books, so that they can have the different options for combat. And you basically just repeat through these steps for each round of combat, and then you come up with some sort of solution, resolution at the end of it. Did you beat the bad guy? Did you yield because he was really kicking your ass, and you're like, wow, there's no way I'm gonna win this combat, and I don't really want to be in a hospital bed for 2 months. So I'm going to yield, and I'm going to be his prisoner, or whatever the case may be. Defeat, that's when your health is at 0 or lower. And vicious weapons always deal out death. It's just one of those things you got to learn about the system. Maiming, ransom, take the black. These are all options for defeat. Unconscious. Foe determines the result. So this is where some of that, I think a little bit of that story game vibe is kind of leaking into the system. If you yield, you choose the outcome. You can burn a destiny point to ignore your opponent's decision. So let's say you yield, and as per the rules you normally go, the person that beats you gets to decide what's happened. Like, okay, I beat you, you are going to take the black. You're like, okay, that would kind of suck for my gaming career, so I don't want to do that. So you burn a destiny point, and you can basically, I think with the GM's permission, come up with some sort of logical solution for how this is going to resolve itself. A little bit of a tricky part is the way that combat damage, and there's some negative modifiers and such, that you can choose instead of basically losing your health. So injuries, as they're called. You can give yourself a -1 penalty, and this is off the total of all your dice, and ignore up to your endurance rank and hit points. So let's say you took, 10 damage, and your endurance rank is 5, so you only take 5 damage. But you have a -1 penalty that stays with you for the rest of the combat. There are wounds. This is where you remove all hit point loss, but you have a -1 dice penalty. So let's use the same example. You just, you had 10 damage coming at you. You're like, okay, that's a lot of damage. Maybe I already have some penalties from taking injuries before. Okay, I'm going to bite the bullet, and I don't want to lose my health, so I'm going to try to balance this out and get some negative dice now. So instead of taking those 10 damage, you just have a -1 dice penalty to all the future rolls you make through that combat. So when I was reading through these rules, it kind of just made me think of someone juggling balls. So you might have like the hit point ball, and then you might have the negative modifiers ball and the negative dice ball. And you have to try to figure out how much of each you want. And I would suggest a balanced approach. But again, it might depend on how you view combat, how you view the tactics of it. Maybe you have a lot of hit points and you think, okay, it'll take me a long time to get these back, but I'm willing to do that because I really want to win and I don't want any more negative modifiers. But maybe you're the opposite. Maybe you don't have a lot of hit points. So you're going to take more of these -1 modifiers. You're going to take more of this -1 dice penalty instead. So it's interesting. It has lots of different levels, and it could be confusing if you get like kind of lost with the terms. So like I said, injuries are the -1 penalties. Wounds are the negative dice penalties. And like I said, healing is natural, and it takes time. It's not instant. It's not bazam, you're healed. so keep that in mind. There are tournament rules that I read over, but I don't know. I'll be honest, I skimmed them. There are advanced combat options as well, and again, I kind of skip these two. I'm more of a rules light guy. As long as I know how to hit people and what kind of damage to take, that's just the way I roll. But those options are there if you want them. A little bit more crunchy details. There's things like fumbles, criticals, reach, fatigue, etc. Chapter 10 is Warfare, if you like that sort of thing. That's the one I'm going to call it. I pretty much skimmed over this section. In most of the time that I've ever used role-playing games, and there have been, sort of battlefield tactics and so forth, I generally put that in the background as things that are just happening in the scenery, and as I would describe a town or NPCs or anything else that's going on. This game actually has mechanics for actually battling out things on the battlefield itself. And I could see where a lot of people might like this, especially people who like war games, War Machine, Warhammer, that sort of thing. It seemed like it was all very well and good, but to be honest, I've never really played any wargaming games. While I think they might look cool, I usually walk past the tables and just say, oh, that looks neat, but I really have never got into more of it. So even if I did go through this and read it line by line, I don't know if I would necessarily know if it's a good, battlefield system or not. And since I'm really not going to use it, I didn't really spend a lot of time on it. But this might be a situation where you love that sort of thing, and it's in there. It's if you want, to have it in your game, you want to actually have a battlefield scene. Maybe the Starks and Lannisters are going at each other, and you have picked one side or the other to support. I can see where that would fit into a game perfectly. But again, for me, it's just not my thing. So we'll just move on. Chapter 11 is the Narrator, or as I like to basically just call it, the GM. There are lots of different words for that name, and I just stick to the same names. That's another thing about this game, too. Instead of some common nomenclature for gaming terms, they seem to put their own little stamp on everything. So, like when I read other RPGs, I kind of have to translate. Okay, this is what GM is, this is what NPC is, this is what this is. And I just like to keep it all the same for the most part. So Chapter 11, what's in here? There are general GMing suggestions and rewards for your players, emphasis on portraying the darkness and light of the setting, and the darkness and light that resides within the soul of every person. There's things like appropriateness, dilemmas, treachery, history, horrific realism, and just the idea that no one is safe. There's no script immunity here. Even if you're like a really favorite character, you might die, as we have basically seen in the books if you read them. Also in this section is something called the routine success. And these are ways to succeed at easy tasks when you have a higher ability rank. You basically do not have to roll the dice all the time, depending on what your rank is. Now, I know that some of the World of Darkness has done this as well in the past, but it's interesting that it's in here. It gives you a situation where, okay, your status is really high, they're a small folk, they're basically going to do whatever you tell them to do, unless you've really pissed them off to the point where they just don't even care if they die or not. So these are things to think about. Remember that PCs can use different abilities to achieve the same results, and as a GM reminder, be flexible. If someone can sort of wheel and deal how they're going to use this ability, try to listen to them, because like I said, these abilities are more like stats with skill elements thrown into them. So be willing to listen to your players and see how they want to go about doing things, and maybe they can be inventive and just come up with something cool. And as long as you can kind of figure out, okay, well, that sounds like this ability, go ahead and roll that one. That's perfectly fine. There's no one's gonna come and rack your knuckles with a ruler or something if you do something wrong. So just be flexible. Some of the setting difficulties are detailed, and there's a % chance in a certain table that you can use to get some ideas. Miscellaneous things are also countered, basically like sustenance, drowning, starvation, heat, travel, cold, acid, disease, drunkenness. They talk about falling damage, which is basically handled in hit points, injuries, and wounds, depending on how far you fall. So it's not just like a d6 for every 10 feet. Noble houses. Goes through a little bit and defines some of the things that you might have not been able to find earlier on in I think it's Chapter 6, House and Lands. So things like decline is in this section, and it was missing in Chapter 6, so that's a slight oversight in the book. It describes more about what the house fortunes mean and how to do them. Magic is touched upon briefly, but if you remember in the beginning of the series that magic really isn't prevalent at all, and a little bit of a spoiler here, but well, maybe I shouldn't do that anyway. But magic is an option, especially if you're running a role-playing game. And maybe your Westeros is different. Maybe magic is higher than in the books. Remember that just because this setting is so detailed and well established, that doesn't mean that you can't do your own thing with it. You can't have certain NPCs stay alive and other ones die. It's all really up to your imagination and how you want to take things. Just be sure that the players know, okay, this is my version. Don't expect everything to be the same way it is in the books, because that would also bring some surprise to the players, especially to those players like me who have read the books 5 or 6 times over, and they kind of know basically everything that's happening in most of the major NPCs and a lot of the minor NPCs. But magic is basically more of a narrative tool in this system. They might change that later with some more supplements or something, but as of right now, just reading the core book, that's the case. Basically, since it is mainly non-existent at the beginning of the series, it's really not mechanically in there. It's more of a flavor thing. Things like green dreams are discussed and other things like that. Perhaps in your game, maybe, the red priest can be staring into the fires, and that can be something that you can incorporate into your game. NPCs, there are tips for creating them, things like, mooks or secondary characters. There's also tertiary characters, so they have like a 1, 2, 3 breakdown where basically the main NPCs are made a lot like the player characters are, and then everyone else is kind of a little bit less mechanically and a little bit less mechanically. Yeah, and NPC characters are pretty easy to make the way they have it set up. There are 7 pages of NPCs, animals, and supernatural monsters, but of course you're probably going to want to make your own NPCs and just generate some more on your own. Playstyles, they talk about adventurers, free folk, the Game of Thrones, historical, and you can actually do that in a different era than the books are set in. And these are just different ways of going through and playing the game. The general assumption is that you're going to be a minor house and you're going to all belong to that one house. And what these do is kind of break that mold a little bit. You can be adventurers that are, in the free companies across the narrow sea. You can be free folk above the wall. The Game of Thrones type of game is where everyone plays a lord of a house, and you're literally trying to defeat each other or make alliances or backstab each other. And that is more, I would say that would be less, it could be less role-playing, depending on how you do it. But again, if you're, traveling to other lands to talk to those other rulers, there might be a lot of role-playing there. So it depends on what you're looking for. I think that kind of game would be interesting just to try out, because I've never done anything like that, where you're, each one of you is plotting and you're making secret moves and, maybe revealing them at certain times. So that would be interesting. I think that would take a lot of work for a GM to pull off. There, like I said, the different eras, the historical aspect, where you can go back to, when the Targaryens were still running things before, Robert Baratheon showed up and took over. And you can also do things like the Night's Watch, where the game is set, everyone is a black, has the black garb of the Night's Watch, and that's where you set your game. So even though the general assumption is you're going to be a minor house, feel free to do your own thing with it, set it off in somewhere else. If you thought the house generation system was a little bit crunchy, that's not for me, you don't have to do that. You can just have a bunch of adventurers, and it can be more D&D-esque, where you're wandering around, doing odd jobs, and you can be sell swords, those sorts of things. So keep that in mind. There is a nice big index on the back, and that's always helpful, especially when there's so many terms that are slightly different, or you're not sure, okay, what's an injury again? What's a wound? What's composure? Is composure the same as frustration, or is it slightly different? Things like that. So it's nice that you have a nice index to check things out. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching my A Song of Ice and Fire RPG review. I've pretty much just gone through and said a little bit about my thoughts on the game. These might not necessarily be your thoughts, but I'm only my own person and I can't read your mind. So, overall, I really enjoyed reading this. I love the setting. I love the novels. I think George R.R. Martin is, as some people have called him, the American Tolkien. And I like the setting a lot. To be able to play in this setting, I think, would be a lot of fun, and it would bring more of that social interaction that I don't always get in my other games. That's one thing I've always tried to incorporate more of, but I kind of struggle with that to some degree. I think some of the mechanics in here can definitely help with that. Even the social mechanics, the social combat sections, where I've talked about that's in the past, that's been kind of a stumbling block for me, where I tend to lean more towards just straight role-playing, what you actually say is what your character says. But it's interesting, especially, I think it fits the setting. It just seems to work that words can be deadly. So overall, I really like this book. I enjoyed reading it, and I would love to play in this before I ran it, but maybe someday I'll run a one-shot or a small mini-campaign of this and see how things turn out. As I've talked about before as well, there is a Game of Thrones out-of-print RPG that is based more on the D20 system, and this obviously isn't. It's its own thing. But between the two, there's lots of options and lots of ways that you can try to take a journey to Westeros and run amok in the tragic setting as it is. I enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed it as well, and I'll talk to you guys later.